Welcome to KMET 1490 AM ABC News Radio and the Southern California Business Report with Yvette Walker, a show dedicated to highlighting successful Southern California businesses and the people behind them.
Welcome and thank you for joining Southern California Business Report on ABC News and Talks, KMET 1490 AM, 98.1 FM, and KMET TV. I'm Yvette Walker, live blasting our signal from the center of Southern California, serving a population of over 25 million. Get us crystal clear and on demand by downloading the free live streaming app on Google Play or the Apple App Store. As always, a huge shout out to the team. Mitch, Bill, and Sean, I love you guys, and to our special advisory committee, which can be found at www.scbrtalk.com/advisory committee. All right, everybody, I have the distinct privilege to introduce an amazing historian today. Sierra was born in Orange County, California. She attended Catholic schools in Riverside County and after graduation enlisted in the Army Reserves as a psychological operations specialist. She attended the University of California, Davis, and obtained a Bachelors of Arts Degree in history with a minor in German. Sierra was drawn to history at a young age. On her mother's side, she is a descendant of the Tapia lineage. On one of the soldiers' families of the Anza mission, which colonized Alta California in 1775 and 76. Her father immigrated to the United States after World War II in 1951, and she remembers hearing his stories of war-torn Europe living in a displaced persons camp in Linz, Austria. Her family's stories inspired and compelled her to study history and explore the circumstances and events that affected her ancestors. Upon learning about her early ancestors, she began a winery project to remember the legacy of her ancestor, Tiburcio Tapia, who planted the first non-secular vineyard in Rancho Cucamonga, California. Sierra defines her wine project as an example of the hybridization which occurred in many Spanish colonies, the mixing of European and indigenous cultures. Her vineyard in Calaveras County, California, retains an intact indigenous Miwok grinding rock archaeology site called Chase by the Miwok people. The Spanish adopted a word close to molcajete for the huge granite grinding rocks they found in various places, metate. During her research for Spanish grape varietals, Sierra traveled to Spain over 10 times and imported 3 grape clones into the country through the University of California Food and Plant Service team and introduced species program. Sierra attended courses in the UC Davis wine program as well. Sierra returned full-time to the University of California, Davis to pursue a post-bachelor program in classical Mediterranean history, focusing on the Romanization of Spain after becoming inspired by the plethora of Roman architecture and artifacts she found in her wine travels through the country. Sierra has studied Latin, Attic Greek, as well as German, Spanish, French, and Italian. Sierra traveled extensively throughout India on 3 separate trips, the last one with the University of California, Los Angeles, which culminated in a short film called Baba. Sierra is the narrator for this film. She has studied yogic philosophy and is a current practitioner and teacher of Hatha Yoga. She was trained at the White Lotus Yoga Academy in Santa Barbara, California, and did her advanced 100-hour training with the Yoga Den in Corona, California, and various locations in India. Sierra feels like she has almost come full circle in her hero's journey back to her origins and her ancestors, back to the village to share her experiences. She is currently working and researching for a museum in Calaveras County. Her focus is the early Spanish-speaking peoples of California and their impact on the state of California, both in Northern and Southern California. Wow, you have done a lot, Sierra. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Yvette. I'm so honored to be here. And that was a long bio. I have done a lot of different things, and I just seem to follow my passions wherever they lead me. And now I feel like I've come back full circle to my childhood and the stories my grandmother would tell me. And when I she'd tell me about the missions and her family, and kind of nice able to really look into that history and find those voices that have oftentimes been overlooked or slightly suppressed in the stories of the history of California. And so I really want to speak out and bring some of those stories and those achievements, those accomplishments that the Spanish-speaking people had this huge effect on the early development of California. So I'm really excited to be here. And again, thank you for this opportunity.
Well, I think it's absolutely phenomenal. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And what a treat to learn that you are a descendant of, one of the first wine growers here locally in Rancho Cucamonga, California, the first non-secular vineyard. And, I don't know about everyone that's listening, but I started in Napa because Napa is known as, the wine country of California, and as well as Temecula. But I never would have imagined that actually started in Rancho Cucamonga.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting, and it's interesting to see the development of what happened after the missions were broken up, and how people recovered from that change, that slight shift in the economy. And one of those ways was by beginning these commercial enterprises and fulfilling that niche of producing wine, not only for the missions and these smaller Pueblo churches, but also for consumers who were kind of growing used to this idea of wine being available to them. And so, yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later when we get into land use. But I'm excited for this series and to speak about these different ancestors of a lot of these descendants. In 2004, there's a book that came out by Alexander King, and he basically estimated it's called California's A Brief History, a Brief Overview, and there's over 300,000 to 500,000 descendants here in the state from these original families that came in and settled some of these early cities here in California.
Beautiful. So we're gonna yes. Okay. So we're gonna take it way back, because we are gonna look at the origins and the evolution of California's economy. And you took it back to 1542 with General Portola. So please talk about how mapping the topography in the state assisted with creating those domestic and international trade pathways.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So. A lot of Spanish kind of idea of colonization and empire is off of this Roman tradition they kind of picked up. And so a lot of the beginning, the first things is obviously mapping, looking at your natural resources, surveying your land, and, seeing what you have. And that's exactly what they did. So it's actually started with Cabrillo. He came out and did a lot of the surveying and mapping of the coast. And it's actually the river systems are really important. And one of the advantages California has is these river systems that can link inland trade routes to the ports. And again, so mapping these geographical features, one of the graded kind of legacies that did is it gave us a lot of our early maps of California, which also included a lot of information about the indigenous populations that were here and where they were trading and different things that occurred with them. And so that's a great record that we have, as well as a lot of the early documents about trade and tariff and early laws that took place in California as they were, just beginning to be a port and a military established area. And so, so not only do we have these invaluable resources from these early records, but we also have the beginning of deciding policies like land use and distributing land distribution, agricultural projects, and viability. And then that also kind of gets us to this idea of labor force, which is, obviously one of the more controversial parts of history. And as a historian, there's, it's a treat to be able to look at history, but it's also, it comes with a lot of, there's a lot of horrific things that have happened in the past. And, we want to have a voice for all of that and not overlook some of the horrific things that happened. And one of those was the use of this native labor force. And so again, keeping that in mind as we talk about the infrastructure and these projects, a lot of these things that were built with these kind of enslaved laborers, at least in the beginning, until other laborers came into the state. And then the interesting thing that happened is once the missions were kind of doing their thing, there wasn't a lot of trade going on. And so by 1781, the king in Spain decided we need to start actually making pueblos. We need to have cities. We need to have agricultural centers to be able to supply these presidios with food and products. So we're not shipping it from Spain and it's taking 6 months to a year for them to get their supplies. And so that was a big change in what happened in California later, is the establishment of cities rather than missions, presidios, which had been, the earlier forms of land use. And so it's kind of interesting that starts a whole new era of California with these early cities. So one of the first cities is San Jose that was started, and after Monterey, of course. So Monterey was kind of the customs house and ran all the international stuff. So if you were coming here and you had to get your passport checked, or if you were paying a tariff because you wanted to come and trade, you would be going to Monterey, to that port. And so we can talk a little bit now, moving into trade and kind of domestic and international trade, because I think that's really one of the biggest, kind of the lucrative thing of California. We have such a huge coastline with many natural bays and ports, which makes us a great candidate for international trade. And domestic trade's a little more difficult. We have the Sierra Nevada mountains blocking us. And then we have vast deserts, right, in the south that aren't that easy to cross. But nevertheless, they did it, right? They crossed the mountains, they crossed the deserts, they came by sea. It actually, going up the California coast could sometimes take 3 or 6 months by ship, just because the currents, the rockiness, shoreline, boats would get, ships would get blown out to sea. And so what they decided, rather than wait 6 months for a ship to come from Baja to Monterey, they figured maybe we need to do an overland trail. And they had the coastal trail. They had the El Camino Real was there for since 1769, and that's about 600 miles. And so that was a very useful trail connecting the missions for trade and for communication. But they really wanted something more direct to supply the missions rather than the ships, and as well as the presidios. And so that was kind of the impetus behind the Anza Trail and some of these other trails that were more overland trails. And so the Anza Trail, starting actually in Mexico and going up through Arizona, really began the first interstate transport here in California. So it linked us up with some interstate transport routes to be able to move materials and goods, food supplies, and stuff like that to the missions from Mexico and Arizona. And a lot of those were mule trains, oxen were used a lot. And so some of the other domestic goods that they traded, a lot of people have heard about the missions and their tallow and hide trade, and how those are some of the main goods that they produced. And so it was quite hard to trade when you only had very few items that you're producing, but they still actually made it work. And the hides were known as California greenbacks. So those became quite lucrative to trade. The trade mostly went to the East Coast. And also Britain and Europe bought the leather that came from that. And then eventually, I kind of have a funny anecdotal story about that. A lot of these ranchos, only could produce tallow and hide, candles, soap, those kind of things. And one of the doctors, Dr. Marsh, and those of you who maybe are familiar with Dr. Marsh, he's one of those colorful pioneers that has a very interesting story. And he ended up getting paid in all these hides. And he had this complaint that his doctor's office looked like a leather warehouse. And he had to get rid of these hides. And so he ends up starting an export business and, that entrepreneurial spirit back then. And he starts a nice business selling the hides to Boston, Massachusetts, and is able to kind of recoup some cash for his efforts there. And so it's really interesting to look at how these early ideas of supplying the missions set up these trade routes, the ports, as well as these agricultural centers to produce food locally and not have to, definitely ship it long distance.
Right. And it's so fascinating to, examine that and to see that connection to the missions, that the missions were basically the genesis to the development of local cities built specifically to provide the economic needs for the missions, right? So create the goods, grow the goods, distribute the goods to the missions over land and sea. How long was it before they started creating efforts to head further eastward?
So a lot of the push to go east was more motivated actually by the gold rush. So for the earliest time, most of the developed land, most of the activity that was going on was all along the coastline or up to about 30 miles in, especially after 1833, when the mission lands were broken up and redistributed as land grants to a lot of the families here in California. And so they really weren't going into the foothills. That's why a lot of the tribes that were up there were pretty much untouched or rarely, disturbed until a lot of the overland migration happened later. And but it's interesting, even though they didn't go into the hills, they still were up in a lot of the canyons and the areas in Southern California. And so we have an early story of actually gold being found quite a few years before it was in Northern California. So we all grew up with the story of James Marshall discovering gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848, but it was actually found, first recorded finding was in 1842 by a gentleman named Francisco Lopez, who was down in Southern California, actually in the region of Castaic. And there's actually a state park. It's Placerita Canyon State Park, and that's where he found gold and actually recorded it. And I think he was digging for onions or something when he found gold. So
that was his lucky day, right? You're digging for onions instead you get this gold nugget.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That kind of started the gold rush, and the gold rush has an interesting history, and how the Spanish speaking people fit into the gold rush is actually really fascinating. There was a lot of early mining that had already been done in Mexico, and a lot of mining techniques that were developed down there and actually imported into California and to help process the gold. And so dry panning is one of those techniques that what came from the Spanish speaking miners. And it's a kind of a method of similar to wet gold panning, but you're just using the air to kind of take away the lighter particles, assuming the gold's heavy and it's not going to blow away. They also had a very important hard rock mining. So in the California gold rush, the first was this placer gold, that was kind of in the riverbeds and exposed already from millions of years of weathering and evolution. And then that first gold rush only lasted about 10 to 12 years. And then the miners had to start following these quartz veins into the mountains to find the rest of the gold. So they started the tunneling, the blasting, and creating these deep mines. Some of the mines we have just here in the county one of them was over 4,000 feet deep. Wow. So intensive, really intensive land use. But what the Spanish-speaking people did before they got to that period is they had developed this a way to process the quartz and grind up the quartz to expose the gold veins inside of it. And those were called arastras. And they were like these ground kind of grinding circles where they would grind up the rocks. And so that early technology was taken, and many of the mines, even way up here in Calaveras County, would import miners to build these technologies to process the rocks. And so we have a lot of records of saying, oh, there were 6 miners came from Sonora, Mexico, and they built 4 arastras to process the rock here at, the Angels Mine. And so a lot of their footprint was felt even in the foothills, like you said, even though they weren't necessarily up here living in that earlier time. It was more a little bit later after the gold rush.
Right. And so I know one of the topics that we're going to discuss was the hybridization of, the populations that were here. Please talk a bit about that and how that contributed to the economic growth overall in California.
Yeah. So, hybridization, again, is one of those subjects that can be seen from many different lenses. Depending on the lens, I'm a hybrid. So for me, I kind of see it as a good thing. I have, native blood. I have Spanish blood. My dad's German, and so I am a hybrid of many different cultures. And but the hybridization that took place here, a lot of, I think, kind of the issue with the whole European conquest and invasion of the New World had to do with the fact that the disease rate was so high. So in some communities, you'd have a 97% die-off, which means, out of 100 people, 97 are gone. So your culture is gone at that point. There's the 3 people left are not able to continue your culture, continue your language, carry on your traditions. And so what happens is this cultural genocide, and and then you have the intermixing of the people is kind of what saves it from completely from us just losing that DNA forever. And so it's kind of like a last ditch effort in some sense, but at the same time, when that cultural mixing, it could be good in some ways because it can allow both cultures to have a voice and try to, mix that voice. And so for us, when we bought this piece of property and it had this huge rock, it's not that huge, but it's probably about 12 by 6. And it had these big grinding holes in it. And, people are like, you have to excavate, you have to look for arrowheads, you have to do that. And I was like, I don't want to touch this. I actually want to leave this preserved because this isn't my land to rip up and look for treasure. And so I think that's kind of one of the issues with archaeology that makes it so controversial is they often go in and look at these sites and collect these artifacts and stick them in museums, and they don't really think about whose land this was and what may have occurred there, and it could be sacred to people. And so for me, I just, we kind of left the hill, we planted the vineyard around, we kept that area untouched, and but we really liked the idea of having a hybrid name, of having a name that represented this fact that the Europeans came here, brought the grape varietals, and intermixed with the people and created a whole new economy. And so we kind of try to tell that story and on our vineyard, and it's been a really fun kind of experience for people to look at that, because so often California history is the natives were here, and then there was the missions, and then the gold rush, and now we're here. And it's like there's so many little stories and little things that are glossed over or trivialized rather than given the time and the space for people to understand how diverse our culture was even back then, and how many different people had an effect on it.
Absolutely. And you brought a great topic to mind. Looking back at the history, it's kind of hard to swallow sometimes when you look at the painful things that actually occurred. But, I love that bring in the hybridization of the communities and the people. And genetically speaking, I've always learned that, it tends to increase survival rates for a variety of reasons. And myself being a hybrid, Spanish, Italian, a little bit of Irish, and a little bit of everything. But you know what? We're going to come up on a break and we'll be right back. Okay, Sierra? Yvette Walker here with ABC News and Talk, Southern California Business Report with Sierra Rose, Archives Director of the Calaveras County Historical Society, with an overview on the origins and evolution of the state of California's economy when we return.
Hi, I'm Dana Rademacher with MGR Property Management.
A lot of people wonder about the value that property management has for their property. Property management can include all property types, including residential, commercial, and HOA. It is valuable because property managers are experienced in what can happen at your property. We're aware of liabilities. We're able to do predictive and preventative maintenance. We know what is coming up with the changes in the weather, the seasons, how old certain aspects or different capital projects at your property are. We're able to best negotiate contract pricing, legalities with your tenants, and anything else that you may need to ensure that you're getting the full value of the property. If you're interested in speaking with the representative at MGR Property Management regarding your property management needs, you can visit our website at mgrrealestate.com, or you can call our number at area code 909-581-6600 to be connected with the representative.
Ontario International Airport is onto a better way to fly with over 65 daily non-stop flights to more than 20 major destinations and the easiest airport experience in Southern California. Visit flyonto.com/Ontario to learn more about Ontario International Airport today.
Cal State San Bernardino is home to the only School of Entrepreneurship in California. With globally ranked degree programs, you can start your journey today to become a successful entrepreneur. Learn more and connect at entre.csusb.edu.
Hi, I'm San Bernardino County Sheriff Shannon Dykes. If you're looking to start an exciting career in law enforcement and make a difference in your community, we are hiring dispatchers, nurses, deputies, laterals, and many more. For a complete list of our jobs and more information, visit sheriffsjobs.com.
The University of La Verne is rated first in California for alumni satisfaction. Learn more about accelerated programs offered online and on campus in La Verne, Irvine, Ontario, Burbank, or College of the Canyons. Visit go.laverne.edu. The University of La Verne. go.laverne.edu.
Hi, Ray Lance from the Diamond Center in the Claremont Village here. One of the coolest parts of a third-generation family business is getting to know the families we serve through generations. Once you experience our friendly service, our fair and transparent pricing, and our beautiful jewelry that we make to last a lifetime, you'll stick with us too. Come visit us in the Claremont Village or at Lantz, L-A-N-T-Z, diamondcenter.com and see what makes us different.
Welcome back. Yvette Walker here with ABC News and Talk, Southern California Business Report with Sierra Rose, Archives Director of the Calaveras County Historical Society, with an overview on the origins and evolution of the state of California. Thank you again for being with us today, Sierra.
Thank you, Yvette. I'm really honored to be here, and this has been really fun. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is such a fun conversation. And prior to the break, we were talking about the hybridization of cultures, of peoples, and, agreeing that ultimately, it kind of strengthens us. And at that time, it may have strengthened communities and peoples against, illnesses that had otherwise wiped out, as you had mentioned, about 97% of populations due to those just the different diseases from different countries that people just were not immune to. But as we move further down the pipeline of California's economy and the initial trade pathways that were existing over land and on sea to service those missions, we're going to start looking at international ports and gifts that were born of those efforts as well. Please talk about that and how that contributed to the greater infrastructure that was being developed at the time.
Yeah, so the port system was really interesting. Spain had a very kind of not a very progressive policy. We'll just put it that way. They didn't really encourage trade for these colonies over here. They didn't really want the colonies trading with other countries. And so between 1769 to 1824, there was only about 2.5 ships, so 2.5 ships a year would come to the ports in California, to Monterey. So very few ships, very few supplies. There's even stories of the soldiers at the presidios almost starving because they did not have, they were not supplied well. So once the Mexican War of Independence happened and they moved away from Spain, they decided to really open their ports, international ports, to trade with these other countries. So Russia was here. They were trading furs. They were coming down the coastline from Vancouver and that area. We had the British ships here. We had French ships. And then we also had the China trade that was very lucrative. And so the first port down in Southern California, that was a land grant in 1784. And it was about 48,000 acres, and it was to a retired soldier. And he was in the Portola expedition, and he was able to work with the monks and the priests at the Mission San Gabriel and actually start to develop the port at San Pedro. So San Pedro was the first port in LA. And by 1805, it was bringing in ships. International ships were stopping there. So, of course, they still would go up to Monterey and check in and pay their tariffs. And then from there, they can go to some of these other ports, San Pedro being one of the larger ports that, again, later was connected in with LA and became the whole LA port, that whole little bay there. But some of the other cities, San Diego, Ventura, also had a port. San Juan Capistrano, San Francisco as well, also had ports. So they could go to these smaller ports and trade as well. And so the China trade I want to talk about, because that really boosted the California economy and was the first international route that was really lucrative. And so the Chinese were very specific about the goods they wanted. They really only wanted 3 things from us: and Spanish silver. They wanted ginseng, and there's a source of American ginseng that was actually grown in the Appalachian Mountains. So on the East Coast, they would ship out ginseng, take it all the way around to California, grab some silver, and then in California, the one item we had that was very desired in China was otter pelts. So the California sea otter, our little furry guys out there, were a huge commodity. And at one point, I think it was around 1840, you could get $1,500 for a single otter pelt. So you could get wealthy pretty quick back then. And the otter pelts were usually traded with some of the native tribes, like the Chumash and different tribes that were down there, or tribes around Monterey. So that was kind of contributing to that economy as well, taking those over to China. And then from China, we got a lot of goods. China had a lot of stuff that we wanted, luxury items, silver, obviously porcelain, as well as silks and cotton and linens. And so a lot of those things that the people that were here and were building homes and were trying to, create their, decorate their houses, really wanted these luxury items from China because they were just so few and far between.
Right. And so my understanding of ginseng is it's an herbal supplement that it assists in reducing the onset of dementia, of Alzheimer's, and it's regularly used in teas and capsules and things like that. So it's interesting that they identified it here and made a concerted effort to continue, to bring it into China.
Yeah, it was, yes, a very desirable item. And one of the things we also got from China that I didn't really mention that was a huge item was opium and tea, and also ginger. So those three things were brought in as well. And the opium and the ginger became very medicinal for up here in the gold mining towns. Some of the miners would even be buried with their opium pipe because it alleviated so much of their pain, physical and probably mental, while they're up here struggling, trying to make a go at finding some rocks.
Some golden rocks, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so that's what I was. So after Mexico took over, so from the short period of 1825 to 1845, there was 25 ships per year coming into these ports. So it went from about 2 ships to 25 ships. And so that, you can imagine the growth in trade and imports and exports, and the growth of these ports was a big deal when Mexico opened up these ports.
Right. And then so as things start to grow, so does, the use of land, how you use your water, how you distribute power, and what that infrastructure looks like as everything starts to grow. Please talk about that as well.
Yes. So one of the interesting infrastructure projects I'll talk about, because it's kind of a fun one and a famous one, and it's down in LA. And it was actually one of the first things they did in LA when it became a city in 1781 was they built an aqueduct. So those of you who've been to Spain, at that time, some of their aqueducts that were Roman were still in use. And so they were able to kind of look at these things that had been working for a long time and copy parts of the construction and rebuild them. So it was a gravity-fed aqueduct that was all lined in brick, and it would bring water into the city. And then it actually eventually had a water wheel that would pump water into a couple of storage tanks. So very early on, they knew the need for water storage, also drainage. So they built this big kind of drain. It was kind of a drain and an aqueduct, and it was called the Zanja Madre. It's the mother trench. And it was a very big engineering project for LA, and they constantly had to maintain it and upgrade it. And so a lot of people worked on that, and it was a big civic project. So again, the idea that these pueblos were agricultural centers really helped also work with water issues and land use as far as getting water to these agricultural areas, whether they were going to put in vines or olives or citrus or perhaps other produce products. And so they continued to, most of the building was done out of adobe, but they did make some bricks. They did get a lot of materials on the ship. So anytime they needed specific types of wood or metals that they could take into their forges, into their blacksmith shops and make more tools, make pieces for horses, saddles and bridles and that kind of stuff. So a lot of the times they would just get the raw goods from these incoming ships and then locally be able to fabricate the items that they needed in their local shops.
So it served very well to receive those raw materials. So talk a little bit about land use and ranching that evolved as a result of having more of these resources as well.
Yeah, so ranching kind of started with the missions again, and the introduction of the longhorn cattle and horses into this area. And, the second voyage of Columbus, he actually brought a lot of those animals to the New World, as well as a bunch of produce and cuttings and all that kind of stuff. And so there was a lot of products here for them to grow. And so for the land use, during the beginning of the distribution of these land grants, it was very slow in the beginning. From 1784 to 1831, there was, so for this 47-year period, there was only 39 land grants given out. So less than one a year. But after the secularization of the missions and the mission lands were broken up, within a 2-year period, from 1833 to 1835, there was over 60 land grants given. So now it was like 30 a year rather than less than one. And so they really had a lot of land to use. And so the whole idea with the breakup of the missions for Mexico was they really felt that the missions were loyal to the Catholic Church in Spain. And they didn't like that. They wanted to replace the Spanish Franciscans with local priests, with priests from Mexico, and they wanted the mission lands. The missions owned in Mexico over 90% of the land. Here in California, it was a little bit less, but it was still close to 90% of the land. And so it's hard to have a commercial economy that's not, connected to the missions until after they started to break them up. And so when that happened, a lot of these early ranchos became entrepreneurs. They had to figure out, how do I use my land? How do I make it profitable? And that kind of became this new upstart of the agricultural industries, as well as mining and other technologies that they employed on their properties to make them viable, to really turn this piece of raw land into something that can provide for their families.
Absolutely. And so with all of this development and all of this infrastructure being, realized by the various facets of the wild California economy at the time, please talk about government and representation at the time and how public policy influenced or impacted the economy of that time.
Yeah, so again, there was a lot of different changes. So California under Spain had a lot of appointed officials that were under the viceroyalty and the commandants at the presidios, and that system kind of broke down again after Mexico took over. And but Mexico had a lot of problems trying to deal with this outlying territory. It was never really got adequate funding and never had adequate protection. A lot of letters were sent to the Mexican government asking for more soldiers, asking for more supplies for the Presidio, asking for new cannons. They had a lot of these old rusty Spanish cannons still hanging around. And they really had a need to secure the coast because there were so many incursions now of illegal immigration, illegal trade. And they were starting to kind of crack down on the fact that people were constantly entering this area illegally and squatting on the land. And so that became a big deal. And so what happened, there was a real lack of representation. So, and the people living here in California felt that having a governor appointed in Mexico City and sent here was not really effective. Okay, they had no, context of what's going on here in this front town versus Mexico City. And so they really wanted local representation. They really wanted to be heard. They really wanted to get their needs met. And so what would happen instead is they would just get these unfunded mandates. They would constantly be getting mandates from Mexico saying, do this, send soldiers here, protect this, stop, the illegal trade, stop the shoplifting kind of going on at the ports and everything. And they just were like, we don't have enough money or soldiers or supplies, weapons, horses. I mean, none of it. Ships.
Right.
And so it was just these mandates and a lot of demands made from a government that was very far away and very out of touch with what was going on and the needs of the people. And so they revolted. In 1831 was the first kind of beginning of the battles. And at the time, the Mexican governor, Manuel Victoria, actually fled. There was a battle at the Cahinga Pass, which is, of course, down there in California, down in Southern California there. And so that was one of the first battles. And then they kept appointing other governors. But by 1836, Alvarado, so Juan Bautista Alvarado of Monterrey, actually kicked out the governor, Mitchell Terena, and took over. So that was kind of the beginning of the California Revolt. And they raised the flag. So if anybody sees that red star on our flag, that's actually when we were the Lone Star State. And we were looking for representation. We were looking for a government that upheld the laws and was going to adequately deal with the situations that these California residents needed. And so there was a lot of different people and countries kind of eyeing California. And they, the Russians wanted it, British wanted it, French were looking at it. Spain had kind of given up at that point. But obviously the Americans, the US government was extremely, extremely interested in California. And so those representatives, after throwing off Mexico, started to be, kind of question, like, who do we really want? Do we want to align with one of these countries? Do we want to have our own country? I mean, it's California. We could be our own country with our economy and our resources and everything. And even back then, I think they had a sense of that. And so we were a pretty good bargaining chip. And the Californios, they really decided that the United States was the way to go. They believed that the United States was a true democracy and upheld its laws. They believed it was a place of adequate representation, and so that's why they actually chose to go and support the efforts to make California part of the United States rather than stay with Mexico or go with someone else. And so as the California, as the Constitution was written and all these things happened, they really were trying to keep the laws in place that had existed before, that Mexico and Spain has set up, like these land use laws and different things like that. Some of that didn't happen, and that's a whole nother story, is these land use cases and people having to prove ownership of their acreage and how that changed. But the interesting thing in California is that it was really, they needed their voice to be heard, and they needed someone that was going to be there and be hands-on and work with them for solutions. And that's what they weren't getting from Mexico, and that's what they really were seeking from the United States. And so, but a lot of things, in the United States weren't really beneficial. Like, just an example, like the state property tax laws right now, if you had a big cattle ranch, there's no way you'd be able to really pay your property tax and support yourself, and so the economy is so different now, and the structure of land and taxation has really made that lifestyle completely, not sustainable today. And so we see that representation is really the key to good government. It's really the key to being able to get your population to be able to thrive by having their basic needs met, having someone that they can voice their grievances to, and that they can work together for solutions. And so the lack of representation is obviously leads to revolts, as we've seen here in California. And so it's definitely an eye-opening part of history, in that the early founders of California believed that representation and local governance was really the most effective.
Right. Because when it comes down to those elements and public policy, they do have a very direct impact on how we live our lives, how we conduct business, how we map out the infrastructure, where we choose to invest those monies to grow or to enhance those communities. So it's interesting to see that at that time they turned from the Mexican government that was sending or allowing governors from hundreds of miles away, to govern over a state that they were not very familiar with, and at the time turned to the U.S. government. So it'd be interesting to see those differences in public policy that really triggered that change. But we are coming up to the end of the program, Sierra, and I am so thankful that you shared your time and your expertise with us today. I'm really excited because I'm hoping that this will be the first of a series of formats that is going to focus on the complete evolution of California, coming from its origins and the complete evolution. And as you mentioned, it's painful to examine and to realize some of those origin stories, but also inspiring to see and to learn how far we've come along, and how perhaps even that hybridization of communities and cultures have enhanced that and strengthened those efforts, and what can be in store for us in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the things that we see is that, today people are searching for their ancestors, they're searching for connection, they're looking for their identities within this larger community, and they're looking for their back at their traditions. And I think that traditions are what keep us together, and they override other things that pull us apart, like political lines and parties. And so I think going back into our traditional cultures, and whether they're fragmented, whether they've been suppressed, we can rebuild those together. And especially those of us that are hybrids and we have this wider view of what happened, and we're able to be compassionate. And so we can lead the way and get people to open up and be part of the conversation and work together.
I love it. Thank you so much, Sierra. I look forward to having you again very soon in the future. All right, for everybody listening today, don't forget to find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Check us out on scbrtalk.com, and upcoming events are going to be June 7th, 2023 from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. fontanajobs.org. Job fair and expungement event at the Fontana Chamber of Commerce. San Bernardino County Public Defender's Office will be on site. For more information, call the Fontana Chamber at 909-822-4433 or email jobs@fontanachamber.org. Also want to give a huge shout out and congratulations to the Ontario Mayor's Gala that happened this past weekend at Chaffey High School Auditorium, which showcased a red carpet event and professional Grammy-style musical and dance performances. Over the past 24 years, the effort has distributed over $1.5 million to over 1,300 students through scholarships through the Esperanza Scholarship Foundation. Save the date. Women of Hope's 4th annual Beauty, Bubbles, and Bites is scheduled for Thursday, June 8th at the beautiful Pond Oaks venue in Mount Baldy. This is an exclusive ladies' night out that features the latest in beauty and self-care. To get your tickets or become a sponsor, visit www.hthf.org/beauty bubbles and bites, or contact Daisy Macias at area code 909-509-2094. Don't miss my interview with Assemblymember James C. Ramos, a lifelong resident of the San Manuel Indian Reservation in San Bernardino County. He is the first California Native American elected to the legislature. He was elected to his first term on November 6, 2018, and now represents the 45th district that includes the cities of Fontana, Highland, Mentone, Redlands, Rialto, and San Bernardino. Next week, we will have Heidi and Sebastian Collado of H&S Transport sharing their view of being involved as second-generation family in a family-owned business. We will take a look at the journey of an American dream made possible through the namesake from the company's origins with 2 trucks to the now burgeoning logistics and transportation company that it has become. We'll see you next week, everybody.